Welcome back, Live Oak students. We are here back in the shop, and today we are going to do a video that covers the miter saw. This is our miter saw. It's also a lot of times referred to as a chop saw. We have it labeled there, chop saw. So a lot of times it's called chop saw because of this motion right here, this chopping like motion. There is a difference between a basic miter saw, a compound miter saw, and a sliding compound miter saw. And the basics really have to do with angled cuts and things of that nature. So before we get into some of those specific details, one of the things that I want to point out are just some of the basic parts of this thing. So as you can see here, this would be this handle. You would set your material on what's known as the table. This right here is our table. All your material should always be flush up against the fence. We should never have material off like that. It'll also ensure that you make nice square cuts when you bring the blade down. So here's your table, here's your fence. The material should be flat against the table and up against the fence. In this particular saw, the action is you would grab by the handle, you would pull it down, push it down, and you would make that cut. You could see right here, there's a trigger that you have to hold in order to actually engage the blade. So you have your trigger, right? You have your handle right here. This is going to be our motor. Right here is the blade guard. It's down right now, so it's really nice. It's an automatic guard. So as you come down, you can see the guard opens. As you come back up, you see the guard closes. So that's kind of a cool safety feature. Your hands should never be in this area anyway while that blade is running, okay? Now that we've gone over some of the different parts to this thing, we're going to talk about how to use it. So the most important thing to know about both a basic miter saw or a sliding compound miter saw or a compound miter saw, the most important thing to know is that it is used for cross cutting. We discussed this in our last video, right? Cutting across the grains. This is used for cross cutting material. It is not to be used for rip cutting anything. So we need to know that, one, our material always needs to be longer than 6 inches on each side. So basically your material, you should never cut material that is shorter than a foot. There are some certain exceptions, but basically if you have a piece of material that you need to take more, if it's less than a foot and you need to take some material off, you need to talk to me first before you go and do that. So for example, you would never come up and use that little piece right there. Okay, so keep a general rule. You want to have at least 6 inches on each side of the blade so that it stays up nicely against the fence. You can see how there's an opening back in here. That's where the blade is. So if you have a small piece of wood, it could slide right in there. Okay, so on that note, we never rip material on miter saws. We have different tools for that. So keep this in mind. For everything you want to do, there's usually a tool specific for that job. So if you have this little block right here and you needed to cut, just rip a piece this thin right off of it, you would not use this. You would go and use a different tool for that. So again, the miter saw is used specifically for cross-cutting material, just like this. You want to make sure that that material is over 6 inches on each side. And then also, this particular saw, as you see, when it's all the way down right here, you can see that you can't get very far. Let me lock this. You can see that this material is only so far. This blade only reaches to right here. So it's difficult to tell in the camera, but this is only about 5 inches. So for this particular miter saw, you could never cut a piece of wood wider than the blade will actually cut all the way through. If you do that, you're going to end up getting kickback. So we wouldn't use this saw. We can use the sliding compound saw to cut something a little wider, which I will be showing you here in just a minute. So the next part of this video, what we're going to do is I'm going to show you how to actually use the miter saw to make that basic chop motion or chop cut across the grain of the wood. So I don't have anything marked here. I'm just going to cut the end off of this to show you. A couple safety things to know. You want to make sure that you always have eye protection, right? So I have mine right here. All your loose clothing and all that stuff is all pulled back like we've talked about plenty of times. On this particular machine, always check to make sure that the guard itself is in the right place. Every now and then you might get some buildup in sawdust or whatnot here that keeps the guard up. So the guard might get stuck in this position. We don't ever want that. So before you ever do anything, make sure that the guard is down and it's in the right place. Make sure that these are always tightened, okay? I left that loose on purpose to show you, right? Always make sure that's tightened. We'll make sure this is tightened, just to make sure that this tool does not fall over either way or doesn't slide. Want to make sure that all this stuff is locked in place so that you get a nice square cut. The next thing to do for safety purposes is to always make sure that whatever we're cutting, we have the ability to set it not only down flat, but also up against that fence. If this were, say, a real long piece, you may need somebody to be over there holding it. If it was sticking way out over there, what would happen is it would start to tip on this end, right? So you'd see the weight of it lift the board like that, and you could tell over here in my hand it's lifting. So if it was on there, just actually you could kind of see it like that. If you were to had a nice long board and you were trying to cut the middle of it, you need to watch out to make sure that that's supported, okay? Otherwise that blade will bind. The next thing, speaking of binding blades, you have to be careful when we talk about binding. Binding will happen when there's a really bad pinch point. And the idea behind a pinch point, I'm gonna come down here. If you can imagine this board working like a U, if it was in a U shape, then when you came down with this blade, you'd be coming down here and the board would be flexing. Try to use my hand here. The board would look like this. Instead of being flat, the board would look like that. The blade will catch right inside there and it'll bounce back up. So if my hand is the board, then the board will flex, the blade will hit that pinch point because the board is being pressured up on each end. So that end and that end is being pushed up for whatever reason. Maybe it's too long, or there's a lot of explanations for it. But basically what happens is the board bends like this and it creates a pinch point. When that blade right there comes down, it doesn't cut all the way through, and then it binds and bounces back up. So that's where you get that kickback. We'll talk a little bit more about it in person. It's a difficult one to show you just on a camera. So anyway, our next safety thing to pay attention to is always make sure that it is up to full speed before we make this cut. So we do not want to pull that trigger and chop right down. We want to give it a second, right? Give it a second to come up to full speed, and then we would make our cut. So I'm going to go ahead and set this down, show you how we would use this. I'm going to slide this over. I'm just going to cut a small piece off. I'm not really measuring anything. Okay, I got my hands away from this area. I'm going to hold it down right here. I'm not going to hold it down. My hands are way too close. So I'll be right here, holding it up against the fence. Once again, this is our fence. Pushing down on the table and pushing up against the fence. Other hand's going to be here. Get my safety glasses on, and then we will bring it up to full speed first, and then make that cut. Now you may have noticed that I waited until that thing came to a complete stop before lifting. Okay, so that's an important thing that a lot of people don't do. They bring this thing down, they chop it down, and then they just bring it right back up immediately. Let the blade come to a complete stop before you lift it up. Again, we have this automatic guard that comes down. When you bring it down, it goes up, and when you bring it up, the guard covers it. You just never know. You never want to trust that. We don't want to just come down, make our cut, and then come back up. Okay, you never know what could happen, so we want to be safe. We make the cut all the way through. We let off the trigger. We wait till it stops, then we come up. One of the biggest problems on this saw that people do is this right here. They make their cut, and then let it come up and immediately reach for that. Okay, now you notice what just happened right there? I let go and it did not. All the other times it's coming all the way up. But just that second ago, it only came to about right there. So again, we wait for it to stop all the way. Make sure it comes up all the way. Once it's stopped, then we can remove that scrap wood out of the way. Too many times students will simply cut it, they'll let it fly up, and then they go and clear the deck or the table. They don't need to clear that right away. Let it stop, let it come all the way back up, then you would remove your scrap. Now the reason why we call this a compound miter saw is because it is capable of cutting different angles of your wood. So I'm coming around here on the table. You can see the different angles that you would be able to cut. You also can see back in here, you can also see right here, you can cut angles that are going to be beveled angles. So before we go into showing you exactly how this machine does all of that, I want to explain the difference between a miter cut and a beveled cut. So you can see here on this board that I went ahead and I marked up a few different angles. So that one's 20 degrees, that one's 45, that one's 25 degrees, okay? You would set this on here and you would cut on these angles here or here or here. These are cuts across the grain on what we call the horizontal plane. If we were to want to say cut through the vertical plane, it would look more like this. Now we're cutting through the vertical plane or the thickness, right? This is a beveled cut. So remember, when you cut through the thickness of a board like this, that's what we call a beveled cut. We're cutting through the vertical plane or the thickness of the wood. And if we are cutting across the grains on the horizontal plane, this is what we call a miter cut. So what we would do to cut these angles is we would come down here. We're going to start with the miter cut. So to make a miter cut, the first thing we do is we loosen this knob. We pull this trigger right here, this spring loaded, and then we would just slide the table. Okay, so we can slide it either way. So in this particular case, I want to cut, say, this 20-degree angle. I'm going to come over here. I'm going to slide that point right there to 20 degrees, set this up against it, and I'm now ready to go to make that cut, or that 20-degree miter cut. If I wanted to cut, say, this 45-degree right here, I would slide this over. There's the 45-degree right there. And then slide this in. And now you could see I'm ready to cut that same 45-degree. Okay, so these are the miter cuts. Once again, we're cutting across the grain and we're making angles. When we do make the cut, we want to make sure that it's all the way up against it and held down as well. So there's the miter cut. Okay, moving the table. I'm going to come back to 0, cutting straight. Now we're going to talk about, well, how do I make that cut right there, that 35-degree, what we call a beveled cut? So the first thing I have to do is I have to find where we adjust the bevel. So this right here sets the angles for the bevel, and then there's a lock for the bevel, and that's this big one right here. We unlock that. Now the whole thing is ready to be pushed over to cut these angles. Okay. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna set this thing at 30 degrees. I think that's our 35, somewhere in there. I'm at 35 degrees. Okay, so I got that set at 35 degrees. Now, this is where people have a difficult time with beveled cuts and miter saws. So you notice which way the blade is pointing, and you also notice that I want my angle cut like this. So it gets a little tricky sometimes. In order to make this cut, you would need the blade technically to be on that side to come down this way. But this particular miter saw doesn't swivel both ways. It only moves one way. So you have to make the adjustment. Really, it's not too difficult. You would just come back over here. You would switch your board to this side, and then you actually would have to flip it upside down. And you no longer can see that mark, so I'm gonna come around here, and you can now see that we would be on that same angle. Okay, so it's a little tricky. It gives people a hard time. If you simply just go from, well, I need to cut it like this, and you just turn it over, you can see that you're still cutting the wrong angle. Okay, so you would need to either turn it over this way, or what you could do is you could just plain and simply flip the board that way. Whatever you do, you're gonna end up needing to make sure that your mark comes all the way across to the other side before you do that. So the simplest way would be to take this mark, know that I need it to be on this side, so I would mark that line there. This is where I want my 35-degree bevel to start, and then come down here and make that line. So that's how you would make that bevel cut. You wouldn't need to flip it all the way over, but sometimes that helps people when they recognize it. Either way, as long as you pay attention to the blade is tilted in this manner, and you need that cut to be beveled in a certain way. Notice too that I am still cutting across the grain, okay? I'm not turning this on its side, okay? I'm not doing that at all. There's no reason to do that. So you use the tool the right way. So if you want to cut a beveled cut, you just move the blade over. But the wood still stays flat and you're still cross-cutting. If you wanted to make these cuts, once again, this blade would be straight up and down again, that'd be on 90, and then you would make these adjustments to your angles here. So the last thing I want to show you when it comes to making a beveled cut is what you really need to pay attention to with our fence. So this right here, once again, is our fence. This is our fence. Now this one is an adjustable. It slides out. Okay, so I have moved the blade to where it's got a 45-degree beveled cut, right? So you can see it's going to come down like that. It's going to make that angled cut right there, and it slides right into that spot. Well, if you're not paying attention, and this guard, or sorry, excuse me, this adjustable fence on the top is all the way up, you'll see real soon that will actually hit that right there. Okay, so you can see it hit it right there. Okay, and in fact, that little notch that you see, that is not there for a reason. That is there because a student made that mistake. They didn't adjust this fence here, and they made their beveled cut. They made that beveled cut, and then it hit that fence, and it probably destroyed the blade. So always make sure on these beveled cuts that you are sliding this thing out, okay, out of the way of the beveled cut when you bring that blade down. So the last miter saw that I showed you was a compound miter saw. So it's just a very basic one chop straight down. You could adjust the table to make those mitered cuts, or you could even adjust the bevel on the blade and make a beveled cut. That particular miter saw, as you saw, could only cut wood that's approximately 5 inches wide. So we have another saw in the shop, which is our sliding compound miter saw. So you could see this setup here. I'm gonna back out. You could see this setup. We have our rolling tables right here, right, all the way down. Nice big setup so we can slide long pieces, long boards through here. And then the biggest thing you'll notice is this right here. These are the rails at which this particular saw can slide on. So you can see here, it slides back and forth, back and forth. It is the same exact saw as that miter saw that we were just looking at just a moment ago. The only difference here is this right here, is the fact that it can slide. Now, when you look at it, if it doesn't slide, it comes down, and again, it only can cut material that's about 5 inches wide. But if you were to bring it all the way out, what you could do is now you bring that blade and you can cut material that is a foot wide, 12 inches wide. So what you would do is you would bring it all the way out, you would start the blade, get it to full speed, you would come down, and you would then push through the cut. So we're gonna have to talk about a couple things about that. But that is the primary difference between this saw and the one that we were just showing in the video. One of the differences on this sliding compound miter saw that's really kind of cool is the digital gauge. Okay, so right here you can see we have the miter cut that is read digitally, and you can see that we have the bevel cut that is also read digitally. So just like you learned on the last one, same mechanisms. Okay, we have the locking handle right here. This one's a little different. The trigger's down there in order to slide it. So here it is on 0. Here it is on 0. As we slide, I'm gonna go ahead and slide the table just so you can kind of tell. And I'm gonna slide it over here. I'm looking down, I'm gonna slide it to 25, I think is what I did, 26.5. And there you go, digital reading at 26.5. Same thing, I can go back the other way. I'm at 30 there and 30 up there. So it's pretty cool to have that digital display. You should always make sure on any tool that has a digital display that it is calibrated properly and does in fact cut the angle that you're hoping that will cut. In other words, if it says 30 down there and it says 30 up there, it's always a good idea to just double check to make sure you're actually getting 30 after you do it. I'm not gonna go ahead and do any of those cuts right now, just not necessary, we already saw it, but we could see here, there's that beveled cut. In order to make those bevel cuts, here's that locking handle back here. You would push this way, and then this machine is ready to be pushed over, if you will, to make a beveled cut. So as I move it, you could see the digital gauge reads 18, 19, and 20 right there, okay? So I can go ahead and slide this back up. I'm gonna keep it at 90 degrees. I'm gonna come back here, I'm gonna lock that up, and this thing is all set up. Now, you may be looking at this thing wondering, what in the world happened to this green piece right here? What happened to this green piece was that students had taken the bevel and pushed it over. They pushed the bevel over, they slid this out, and they didn't pay attention to that green piece when they were cutting on that beveled angle, and they chopped it up. Okay, so you have to pay attention to what you're doing. We don't have, just like the other compound miter saw, this particular one, I don't have it in right now, but it also has one of those adjustable fences that you could slide in and out. Right now I don't have that set up on here. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and show you now what the sliding compound miter saw can actually do, the benefits of a sliding saw. The first benefit you'll notice is this right here. Look at how wide this board is. So this is a 12-inch wide board. This is the maximum size that you would be able to cross cut on here. This board, if we brought it over to this particular miter saw that we were working on earlier, you can clearly see that it cannot cut this board, okay? It's not gonna be able to reach, it doesn't slide out, so that's not gonna work over there. So the first thing you would recognize is that the sliding compound miter saw allows you to cut a wider board. So let's go over those rules now. No board wider than 12 inches should ever be cut on here. So 12 inches is the maximum width of a board that could be cut here. And no board should ever be shorter in length than 6 inches, or excuse me, than 12 inches total. Okay, if you have a board that's 12 inches exactly and you need to take a little bit off, and we're talking about the length right now, you want to see the instructor and we can talk about it a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and show you how the sliding compound miter saw works. So the first thing that I'm going to do in this particular instance, you could clearly see that I can't cut all the way through this thing, right? These teeth are going to spin this way. So what I want to do is I want to bring this thing out all the way first. I'm gonna pull the trigger and get it up to full speed. I will then come down and then I will push through in a steady motion all the way through. So it'll look like this. So again, waited until until the blade was completely stopped before I brought it up. It's a really bad habit. Students do it all the time where they just let it come up, make sure it stops all the way. You can see I got that cut all the way through. Here's my scrap piece, goes in the scrap bin, and I now just made that 12-inch wide board the exact length that I need it to be for the project. So that's going to wrap up our video on the miter saw, the sliding compound miter saw. But before we go, let's just go over a couple of the safety things related to those particular saws. So the first thing, as always, is our eye protection, right? We always want to make sure we have eye protection. There's typically going to be ear protection set up on the saw, so you can put ear protection on as well because it's a pretty loud saw. We have a vacuum hooked up to that, so when you start the saw, it automatically starts the vacuum. So that's pretty nice. But even still, you want to have your safety goggles on. The other safety mechanisms that we really want to pay attention to is, we know that there's a guard on the blade, but we always make sure that we bring the blade to full speed before we make that chop cut, right? That sliding cut or chop cut, either one, whatever it is. Make sure it's a full speed before we engage and start cutting, and then make sure that it is completely stopped before we bring that thing back up. So again, it's called a miter saw. The nickname is a chop saw because of that chopping motion. You grab it, you get it turned on, you bring it down, you cut it, and then you bring it back up. We just want to make sure that the blade is safe at all times. So full speed before we cut, and then make sure that it's completely stopped. We want to make sure when we're making those bevel cuts that our fence is not in the way. And then when we are making our miter cuts, not only do we unlock that handle to slide the table around and make that adjustment, but we got to make sure we tighten that handle back up, so we don't want that table moving. And then the last thing is just a reminder on the the sizes of wood. So we never want to cut a wood that is shorter than 12 inches long unless we're cutting, say, like a small piece off on the end. So Rule of thumb, we want to make sure that our cut has 6 inches on each side of the board. It's a general rule of thumb. So it just makes it really easy. If your board is a foot long, you're not supposed to cut it on there, okay? Or make adjustments to it. The next thing is the width of wood. So on the sliding compound miter saw, you can cut a board that is 12 inches wide, but nothing bigger than 12 inches wide. So it's kind of easy to remember. Basically, if I'm using the miter saw, my board needs to be at least 12 inches long, and it should never be more than 12 inches wide. So that wraps up our miter saw video. Thank you guys for watching, and go take that quiz and get it done.